On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Justin Nguyen. He is Technology Director of Enterprise Data and Analytics at Home Depot. We're going to talk about what it's like being hired as a new leader. We're going to go through what that interview process looks like, the questions you're asking. Should you be scared off of something you uncover within that interview process? And we're going to talk about some of that expectation setting, getting into the job, delivering against those expectations stakeholders have as you kind of said some things during the interview process, and see how much more we can get in here with Justin. But I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. Okay, so obviously everyone knows what Home Depot does. In this case, we're going to skip that and dive right into the topic. So, this was an interesting topic because when we were speaking, obviously you're fairly new to Home Depot, so you're pretty fresh going through the interview process, and we started talking about that interview process and really understanding what to expect from the job, right? That part of the process where you're supposed to be interviewing the company. And I guess maybe we'll start off at the top. When you are interviewing for a new role, what are you looking for? What are you trying to uncover in your portion of interviewing the company?
Yeah, so it really boils down to three things, I think. First is the maturity of the organization. And so questions I like to ask during the interview process to give me a little bit of insight into what that maturity curve and growth looks like, or what are your key projects? What are your key initiatives? Certain things to look for are things like cloud migration or digital transformation or modernization. Basically, some major initiative that is a key focal point of the leadership that gives you some insight into not just what they're focusing on, but also what the maturity of the overall org is. The second is the reality of just your space, your domain, right? Like, what are the key use cases in your space? What's already running in production? Tell me about the technology stack. That also gives you a little bit of insight into just how mature your domain is. And then the third and final thing I look for is strength of the team, strength of your resources. A question I like to ask is, how do you recruit top talent, right? Let's pretend I'm just an elite engineer, elite architect. How would you recruit me to join this team? And that gives you a little bit of insight into the talent they're able to attract. Other things to look for and ask for are things like the size of the team, footprint, budget, but basically an understanding of what kind of resources you will have when you step in the door to attack some of the initiatives, some of the priorities that you'll be tasked on.
Absolutely. And obviously going through the process, you're getting high level stuff. And obviously you've outlined some detailed questions you can get down into. I guess one aspect of any technology role is dealing with what was done either prior or what is expected in the future if it's more greenfield. When you are interviewing and you're trying to determine some of the challenges that you might be facing, what are some questions that you can ask to ascertain maybe if there is technical debt, if there's data debt, or if there's other challenges technically that could kind of lead to you not being successful?
Yeah. So technical debt, data debt, it's inevitable. If they tell you in the interview process they don't have any, that's not true. And that's a flag in itself. There's always going to be some. The question and the understanding that you need to have walking into the role is, what are the resources you have to be able to respond to it? Do you have the ability to attack and reduce that debt? Or are you going to be backed into a corner and that debt is just going to pile and pile and pile and eventually blow up into something more serious? And so really the questions and the understanding is less about if the debt exists, and more about, hey, what kind of freedom, flexibility, resources, and other kind of capacities do I have to leverage to reduce the debt?
Absolutely. I guess coinciding with that, as you're going through the process, people are asking you what your vision is, how you expect to make change, how are you going to bring that about? In terms of that part of the interview process, obviously you have to be careful what you're saying because they're listening, but also you don't know what you don't know. Is there a hedge there, or is there more of a open discussion, or how do you handle the dialogue when it comes to tell us what kind of impact you can have here, what things you can look to accomplish in this role?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the role. Obviously, no one answer, one size fits all type of solution. But I think ultimately, one, it's important to be honest. And then two, it's important to constantly reevaluate. Even after you step into the role, you'll gain more experience, you'll gain more insights, and you just become much more in touch with the reality of what's happening as you gain that experience. And so just constantly reevaluating that vision and reevaluating just what the goals are and making the necessary adjustments and changes as you go.
Absolutely. I guess as you're eventually going through these interview processes, you get the job, you start, and expectations and reality start setting in, right? They might be the same, they might be different. When you're talking to the stakeholders, right? Obviously, you're trying to set up a app, you're observing, you're listening. When you are dealing with the stakeholders, and obviously you've gone through the process of outlining what they're hoping to accomplish, how do you start that conversation with them if things are not as rosy, right? You said technical debt, data debt's inevitable. You're coming in there now, and it's like, well, listen, what I thought I might be able to do, or what I kind of had envisioned, reality is going to be a lot different. We're going to have, that dreaded, 6 months or a year plus of plumbing before we get to what you want.
Yeah, and that's kind of the hard part. Stakeholders, they have expectations, and sometimes those expectations, there's delta, there's an asymmetry with what is true reality. And so data is abstract, technology is abstract. You really need to invest time and patience to align your stakeholders to the reality. I think frustration basically occurs when frustration occurs when expectations and reality don't align. It's basically the delta between expectations minus reality. The greater that delta, the greater the frustration. So your stakeholders, they will become frustrated if their expectations are not matching reality. And so again, investing time to educate and kind of reveal what that reality is. Don't assume that they know just because they've been there or they work there. And then manage expectations by investing in their learning and their knowledge. So I guess a quick example, a few things I like to do first is, hey, what's the state of the state in terms of our data ecosystem? Use when you communicate that story, make sure you use data and you use metrics to tell that story, and ideally be able to really kind of help shape the picture, maybe even quantify the difficulty, the impediments of delivering whatever they want as quickly as they want. So some things, for example, are the tribal knowledge required to get data, right? I mean, that's a very common problem, and because of that, there's certain ramp up time for analysts and training time required that just slows everyone down. And so again, being able to kind of identify those things, tell that story, and educate stakeholders is ultimately going to help manage expectations by educating them on what that reality truly is.
Absolutely. I guess one recent in the last 2 years expectation is having some kind of game plan, having some type of vision of where an AI solution can fit in. And I guess every stakeholder, has his or her own view of how immediate or the impact it could have. And I guess you're, pretty new to Home Depot, and we don't want to talk about your AI strategy, but the conversation around AI and what it can deliver and the time and the cost, I think those are things that maybe have been lost in the translation along the way as we've heard so much of the fanfare about it. Talk to us a little bit about that conversation, because that sounds, obviously somebody could be using some kind of chat GPT as an example, and they're like, hey, I'm cranking away at this at home, it seems fantastic, how does that get extended to me? Talk to us a little bit about that expectation walking into it.
Yeah, so AI obviously has a lot of excitement and certainly a lot of applications. I think it's certainly a great tool, and you can do a lot of really, really neat things. I use AI, for example, to generate movie posters of my daughter, and we hang that up at home just to, just to have fun and do those kinds of things. There isn't the question. The harder question is not necessarily what to do with AI, but what to not do with AI. And ultimately, we're all here to solve problems. If AI can solve the problem, great. If it's AI like or close enough to AI, but it solves a problem, I mean, I think that's the bigger priority. So.
Absolutely. I guess when you're looking back over your career, you have experience of joining, some fantastic companies, in your past and, Chewy, 7-Eleven, a bunch of others. Um, when you go into these roles and you've kind of gone through the interview process, when you're to look back, are there any learnings from what you might have wanted to ask, learning of what you should have asked or kind of refining your interviewing of each of these companies?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I mean, there's lots of lessons learned, lots of things where you say, "Oh man, if only I had known, or if I had asked those things, maybe I could be better prepared or better aligned." Certainly, you always have blind spots. So, yeah, I think the more you do it, ideally, you learn a thing or two and get slightly less ignorant. But I'm still very, very ignorant in this whole process, and certainly there's a lot more left to learn.
Absolutely. Did anything stand out, like a couple of key takeaways from that?
One thing I think that's just kind of tricky, and it almost it's probably more of an art than a science, is understanding some of the dynamics and some of the relationships of the leadership. So obviously, when you're interviewing for a leadership role, you're getting interviewed by other leaders, and just trying to get almost like a spidey sense for some of the dynamics between them, and maybe some of the friction, some of the alignment, and just understanding again like where priorities are and where there's alignment and where there's not. I think you can actually read a lot from some of those conversations if you're alert to look for those kinds of things.
Absolutely. And as you kind of mentioned, some of the people relation components of management, right? Some of the understanding of your stakeholders, some of the understanding of the political nature of the organization, where those dynamics lie. When you first are joining a company, I know a lot of times I'm just a silent observer. I want to just listen. Those relationships that you're trying to understand better. Have you seen anything that works better than not in terms of kind of assimilating to those dynamics?
Yeah, so I guess two thoughts there. I think one, you hit on. I mean, you're there to listen, you're there to learn, and the more you learn, the more you understand, and you're able to operate at depth, the better off as a leader you'll be. I'll give a recent or somewhat recent example where I was asking someone on my team to basically implement a certain technique, and they couldn't, because some of the tools that they had to work with, some of the dependencies that were beyond their control, they just could not implement what I thought was a very, very simple technique. And it was a very eye-opening experience, because that's the last thing I want to do, is be another leader with unreasonable expectations that has no touch of what's happening in reality. So to the first point, I mean, you kind of said just listen, 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 learn, walk in everyone's shoes, and be as close to reality as you can, and develop that understanding. The second thing I think that helps is to remember that you're there for a reason, right? You are a new leader, kind of brought in, especially if you work at a big Fortune 500 company. I mean, they have their pick with kind of who can step into that role, but they chose to bring someone in from the outside, and just remember that you're there for a reason, and you bring in a perspective that might not necessarily already be in place, and don't be afraid to leverage that outside knowledge and expertise that you've already worked hard to acquire.
Absolutely. I guess a question that as you're talking about it, I was thinking, when you first join, you mentioned you're obviously going to be reporting to another leader. Leaders are your peers. Understanding your success as a leader is not always easy. Like, you're not an IC. There's not clear-cut metrics. There's dependencies, especially through the ramp-up phase, where there's an expectation of you have a little bit of leeway, but you need to get up to speed. You need to deliver. How do you personally, your internal clock, how do you measure your own value? How do you measure your own ROI, and keep track of that? Because obviously you'll have a one-on-one, you'll talk to your boss, but before that, how do you keep track of your own progress in those initial 90 days, 180 days?
Yeah. So first, especially very early on, I mean, number one goal is to build credibility as quickly as you can. And so you're looking for quick wins. You're looking for wins that have kind of high visibility. You're going to prioritize the key stakeholders or at least some of the influencers of those key stakeholders. So that's kind of one. And then the other thing, kind of if you can get a double win where if you can achieve these short-term goals that align with long-term goals, that's going to also help just make things more manageable. So, it's not hard finding things to do and learning new areas and jumping in where you can. So the bigger challenge is actually figuring out what to deprioritize so that you're not, and one thing that helps with that is just to check, hey, are these short-term goals as whatever outcomes, projects, are they aligned with some of the more longer-term ones that maybe we had talked about earlier, right? Things that maybe you talked about in the interview process in terms of some of the vision that you cast, some of the high-value keystone projects of the org or your org. Is there alignment or not?
Absolutely. And actually, that alignment, I think, is in the short term and the long term. I've asked data leaders this, and you kind of mentioned, I'm kind of curious. When you're looking at the short term and long term scenarios, and you mentioned the double win is that the short term fits in with the long term. In those first few months, as you're kind of formulating your long term, how deep does that roadmap get for you? Obviously, you're trying to qualify a bit of, hey, I still don't know what I don't know, but people want to hear from you as to what you think the problems you're going to solve, when you're going to deliver. You don't want to sound like the answer is, well, I don't know, because obviously that's not what you're there for. But how much of that long-term roadmap, how quickly can you be confident in it?
I think as long as you are making sure you're hitting milestones that might not necessarily have the long-term outcomes that you're looking for, but at least show progress. I think that's pretty critical and pretty key. I'll give an example. I've worked at some pretty large companies, and computing costs, especially in the cloud, are always a fun topic. It's always something that you just have to manage and track, and certainly, you want to manage them without necessarily having detrimental outcomes to the business. There's a balance there, and so that's when, especially coming from the data guy, I obviously like to use data to tell the story, but having some metrics in place to kind of show progress. No, maybe not everything is completely automated, self-healing, Jarvis managing your cloud ecosystem quite yet. But hey, I can show incremental improvement in cloud costs. I can show efficiency. I can show increases in productivity, for example, as well. And then I can also, produce insights off of that data, right? I mean, pretty much everyone now has a massive data ecosystem. Can you maybe map out what that network looks like, analyze that network, find key critical nodes that you need to fortify and make sure that those data sets are locked down, and then also find areas that are of low value but maybe high costs. Those are all very, very doable in the short term, and help you kind of build a robust technology stack or data ecosystem or whatever space you're in, and that aligns with long-term vision.
Absolutely. Maybe one other thing just to touch on is, when you are trying to work to define success within data, I think it's really hard because within software engineering, features work or don't work. I mean, it's pretty, I don't want to say it's pretty cut and dry, but it's a little bit more cut and dry. With data, there's a lot of different moving parts because it's almost as though it could be just in time correct versus not. Something like data science and AI that are even more complex and people have less familiar. How do you work with stakeholders, especially if they aren't used to some more advanced technology projects, to define what that success looks like?
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I love data is exactly what you described. It's also one of the biggest challenges, right? Data is such a unique asset in that it travels from technology to technology, from business to business. I mean, it's an asset that literally touches across businesses, across technology stacks and platforms. And because of that, there's certainly a lot of things that can go wrong. But it's also fun because you get to not just learn about so many different businesses and technologies, but you're also able to add value and contribute and help in so many different areas as well. Um, the measure of success for data with me, especially with stakeholders, is trust and credibility. Data is not useful if you cannot trust it. If you can trust data, then you will use the data. And so in terms of, measuring success, obviously talking to stakeholders, getting a feel for what their understanding of that data is. The other, and this is a little bit more of a proxy metric for trust, is usage. If they're using that data, if they're querying that data set, if they're logging in frequently and you're not just gaining new users, but you're retaining your existing ones, that's also a good proxy metric for how much people trust your data. And so certainly a lot of things that can go wrong. And certainly in my mind, when it comes to data, moving data from A to B is simple, straightforward, especially in 2025. You spend a lot more time and thought and engineering into making sure that data is trusted and reliable.
Absolutely. I guess maybe last question. When you join a new team and you have to evaluate your team and you have to look to maybe help people upskill, and especially as we're touching on data that is becoming more engineering like. Maybe 20 years ago quite wasn't that way, but in the last decade, it's software engineering to me. It's no longer just tools driven data work. When you're looking at that and you're looking at teams and you have to manage headcount and grow your team and deliver some of that complexity of new technologies, a lot of leaders are running into, where do I train? Where do I bring somebody out from the outside? How much consulting do I borrow? That dynamic affects your team, obviously, and you want your team to grow their skills as well. How do you manage that? How do you balance that little trifecta?
So it is a balance. And number one, make sure you are bringing in the right skill set, right? Make sure, for example, maybe it's hard skills, maybe it's soft skills, maybe it's just learning how to interface with stakeholders or whatever added expertise, whatever the gap you identify is, make sure it's the right one. Otherwise, you're going to lose credibility and trust of your team really quickly. But then the other thing too is we're all part of the same team. And I think even if you were to bring in expertise, and my leadership does it to me all the time too, that's an opportunity for me to learn and grow, and that's, I mean, that could be an investment in my own growth as well. And so I think just making sure that there's alignment in terms of some of the perspective and, I don't know, maybe even some of the optics is important, especially to get kind of that that partnership across all different parties.
Absolutely. I love it. Justin, okay, we can keep going with more scenarios, and I'm sure you'll have a great take, but I know you got to get back to it. If somebody wants to follow up with you, maybe they want a slightly more detailed feedback on a question we talked about on the show, what is a good way of getting a hold of you?
Yes, LinkedIn is probably the best. Something I do check regularly.
Cool. We'll make sure we include your handle in the show notes so people can reach out to you. Again, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. These are great questions. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for the episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think when Jess and I were talking about this episode of being hired as a new leader and that process of the questions, interviewing the company you're going to be joining and trying to learn as much as you can. And what do you do in those first 90, 180 days? I mean, there's a lot of moving parts. And if you do have a high profile role, there's going to be a lot of expectations. I think Justin gave us some great insights in how he's handled it and how he deals with some of those situations. We even threw in there a little bit of an AI and dealing with some of those expectations as well. So share this episode out with somebody else who might benefit from it. I'd appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.